Real Washington, a podcast with thought leaders on what's coming next and how ideas become movements. Co-sponsored by the Corporate Council Business Journal, Compro, and the Snyder Center at the University of Maryland Smith School of Business.
Welcome to Real Washington. I'm Richard Levick with Levick, and this is our new podcast where thought leaders from litigation and regulation to Wall Street and movement politics discuss what's next. We started this podcast because we too often miss the signs of the future. Too busy with the now to register what's next. There's always a canary in the coal mine, a warning sign of future crisis when the past becomes prologue. If only we had paid attention. I wanted to start this first podcast with Deborah Kelly, not only because she is a great employment lawyer, but also an old friend. Known for her plain speaking, she is as real as it gets, particularly in Washington, where plain spoken, to say the least, is not a phrase you hear often. A partner at Manette representing employers, we go back over 30 years to law school. Deborah had triplets and still managed to make partner with her law school firm Class. Deborah, you're an extraordinary human being and a great lawyer. Welcome to the show. Nicole Lamb-Hale is the former Deputy General Counsel and an Assistant Secretary of the Department of Commerce in the Obama administration. She is now a Managing Director in the Business Intelligence and Investigations practice at Kroll, one of the world's leading firms in providing risk assessment. We met a few months ago when we served in the same American Bar Association panel, and I was struck by her insights and thoughtfulness. And most importantly, of course, we all have connections to the University of Michigan. Each of you give a little background on yourself. Deborah, I thought we'd start with you.
I feel like I should be wearing a superhero cape after that introduction, but you just play the hand that's dealt you, and it's turned out okay for me. As Richard said, I've been doing employment law for virtually my entire career. It is a very people-centric area of law. A lot of street smarts involved, and therefore it's never dull because what people do, write, say, decide, this will be a good idea to take a picture of and send, makes for lots of interesting litigation, but also half of what I do when life is in balance is I work with companies, boards of directors, to try to make sure that companies are complying with and understanding what their obligations are under employment law. What can an employee expect from a supervisor? What must a supervisor provide to an employee? And make the supervisors understand they are the company, they better act consistent with that or else.
And Nicole, a little background on you, please.
Sure. So Nicole Lamb-Hale. I'm a native of Detroit, Michigan. I practiced law for 18 years in Detroit before joining the Obama administration. And I have since, after leaving the administration in 2013, went to Albright Stonebridge Group doing global strategy consulting. And in my role at Kroll, I work with companies to help them manage risk. And one of the areas of risk that is increasingly important is the risk against sexual misconduct in the workplace. And so everything from doing investigations, which is, of course, reactive at that point, to helping them come up with proactive strategies to avoid finding themselves in these situations. One of the things I always say is that sexual misconduct prevention is just as important a compliance issue as anti-fraud and anti-corruption might be for a company. It's a bet the company kind of issue now, and companies need to take it seriously.
And actually, I think because the allegation is on page 1 and,
Yes.
and juicy if it involves sexual misconduct, the exoneration, if it occurs, comes years later, and the brand damage to a company.
Absolutely.
You are always scrambling, but we didn't do it. So the prevention piece, on TV, people like to see trials. In real life, no one likes to see a trial.
Absolutely.
We want to behave in a way that we never get to a trial, and if an allegation is filed against us, we can kill it quickly because we've done the right thing all along.
Right. No, absolutely.
Nicole, we're now about 12 years into the Me Too movement, although most people are really only aware of it over the last 2 years. What are some of the changes that you see? What are some of the patterns? What's happening in the workplace?
Well, I think that it's being taken more seriously, which I think is an important point. I think that at the end of the day, as I mentioned, taking this kind of an issue as a risk mitigation issue seriously is very important for companies, for their share prices, for their reputations that are often hard to remedy when a situation like this hits the front page. And so what I've seen is, our clients being more willing to talk about it proactively. and look for ways to put in place policies and procedures that demonstrate how serious they're taking this issue, making sure that their employees are trained, making sure that compliance is taken seriously from the C-suite down. So I think that's a positive, actually, that more people, and the more that you see these issues on the front pages of newspapers and you see the corresponding impact on the share prices of organizations, of corporations, I think it's been being taken more seriously today.
And Deborah, you already talked in the introduction about the headline risk, and I thought if you could elaborate on that, but also what you see with your clients and some of the risk and issues that you're seeing.
So we could have a talkathon on this one subject, looking at how this has gone over the years. But I would say, just to put it in context, the first Women's March was in 1970. I should never have had sexual harassment be a concern in my young life. I have daughters in their late 20s. They shouldn't have it in their work life. So if a company today is saying, wow, there's this Me Too movement, I guess we should get training and protocols in place. Good God, where have you been for decades? This is not something that has just been made unlawful. It is something that is surfacing and grabbed the attention of the media. The result of it is, I don't actually believe there's more sexual harassment today than there was 2 or 5 or 10 years ago. I think it's that more people are coming forward because there's safety in numbers, and that's why people who otherwise would have been silent are coming forward. So that is good, because I'm a defense lawyer. I don't have any clients that knowingly employ predators, sexual harassers. Harassment's a pollution that gets in the way of the company doing what it wants to do. It makes people leave even if there's no claims filed. People don't want to stay in an atmosphere like that. So companies want to identify bad people and get rid of them. Ideally, they don't want to have them to begin with. Where we are now is actually the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunities figures, were just released. And it shows that sexual harassment claims increased for the first time in a decade. So this is, I think, cause and effect of the attention that's paid in the Me Too movement, not cause and effect that there's so much more harassment, but there's people who feel they can come forward and talk about it. I don't want to hog the limelight, but later on I think maybe what we want to talk about is what are the ripple effects of that, and have people, in terms of paying attention and taking it seriously, gone too far because they don't understand what it is and they're panicking. Mm-hmm.
Well, I do want to say, Deborah, you are actually here to hog the limelight because, otherwise you're stuck with me, which is a real problem. So I'd love for the two of you to take that and talk about some of the ripple effects.
So I do a lot of compliance trainings for companies of all types, ranging from nonprofits to a lot of work with the financial services industry, which is a nice way of saying Wall Street, which is a different culture. And one of the universal connecting items is everybody thinks when there's a training like that, they're like, oh, dear God, the politically correct police have come in the door to tell me fun dies in the office today. The men feel they've been found guilty by virtue of being born male, and all that awaits is their sentence. And you can just cut the tension because when you walk in. So one of the things I try to do is disarm that a bit just so people can talk. And humor is good to make that happen, but humor does not mean it's a subject that is not serious. But when you get people talking, what I have heard is at the high levels of companies is, we really don't want sexual harassment here. It's horrible for our brand. It's terrible. We're not in favor of that. So here's what we're going to do. Women aren't going to travel with men anymore. We're not going to have male-female work teams. Definitely no eating after hours with women and men if alcohol are served. And I don't think it's appropriate for men to mentor women anymore because that puts them in a one-on-one situation, and no one-on-one meetings with women either. And this is now getting termed, Bloomberg, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, the Pence effect, because as we know, irrespective of party, this is not fake news, real news. His stated opinion is he will not go to an event where alcohol is served without his wife.
And that's really his problem and not a woman's problem.
And if that is to be adopted by companies, in my belief, Richard, is that if sexual harassment claims go down, sex discrimination claims will skyrocket. You can't isolate people for meetings, for travel, for opportunities based upon their gender, as much as you couldn't do it with race or a religion. Nobody would think it's fair to say, you know what, we're traveling. I don't think we should have any Jews on the trip. People would be like, who said that? But somehow when you say, you know what, this is going to be a long night of travel, maybe we shouldn't have women join us. That's like, let me think about that. That's a good idea. No, it's not. It's a bigoted idea. So I think we have backlash now where people are overreacting to their fear of what a sexual harassment allegation would bring. And if they overcorrect, they're going to overcorrect their way, walk out the door of sexual harassment, and walk right into the door of big-time sex discrimination.
No, I would agree. I mean, I think that there's always a risk of having the pendulum swing too far the other way. And there's also the issue of due process rights. And I know we talked about this a bit, Richard. It's really difficult when you have a situation where there's a rush to judgment as well. And I think companies and other entities need to be careful of that backlash because sometimes there are misunderstandings. There ought to be an opportunity to have both sides of the story heard. So I think that's another issue that we have to watch.
Deborah, it looks like you were going to add to that comment there.
Well, in the first instance, if there is ambiguity, it might be nice if people felt they could talk to one another. For example, let's use Joe Biden.
Mm-hmm.
And the stories in the media, Joe Biden, touched someone's shoulder. I personally would not take that.
Neither would I.
As anything offensive or
right.
sexual. And there are some people who are equal opportunity huggers. They are equal opportunity close talkers. But it's okay if I don't want someone to touch my shoulder to say, you know what, I'd prefer you didn't.
Right.
And most people in the first instance would go, well, I didn't know that. Look, a guy in my office was retiring recently, and we were friendly. He's an older gentleman. On the day he was leaving, I went into his office. I had my arms up, and I was like, oh, my God. And clearly I was about to give him a hug. And he went like this, and he said, I don't like to be touched. Now, I was not going to cuddle him.
Right.
I was just going to give him a, yay, you.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned something from that. So if I had said, well, too bad, buddy, I'm coming in,
right.
then bad on me. But I didn't know. So he gave me a cue. Now, please, people who are listening to this, I am not saying it's the victim's fault. The victim should said X. But I'm just saying how these things happen is there's often a micro level where there's a disconnect. And if you could help educate your work colleague to the fact that that's not okay, I don't like
right.
that. Whatever your vocabulary is, you don't have to give them a, burn in hell, you male chauvinist pig speech. But often at the granular level, this can be stopped.
Oh, I agree. I mean, and sometimes you mentioned humor and how humor plays a role. I mean, I remember as a young associate, there were older partners who might get a little too close. It made me feel uncomfortable, but you make a joke about it. And they didn't mean it oftentimes. Or if they did, it was diffused and we moved on. And to the point that you made earlier about the impact on mentorship and professional development opportunities, I mean, it's really, I worry about that backlash because, some of the best mentors I've had have been men. And I would hate for them to, it would have been a shame if they had felt uncomfortable doing that and playing that role in my life because of these issues.
But to be clear, I don't think either of us are saying to the women, well, guys are going to flirt with you. It's just a natural event. Just suck it up and don't get offended. Because you shouldn't have to run that gauntlet to have
That's
a job. But I'm talking about, this is why I use the Joe Biden example, somebody who is just that
It's
way.
their personality. Yeah.
Well, I think the Joe Biden moments, if you will, are complicated for any number of reasons. And Deborah, it was so interesting to hear you speak because in some ways, as you're very articulately providing us with this background, you're also providing a footnote saying, well, I'm saying this, but I'm not saying that. I think all of us have that fear, like we have to establish, I'm not Cro-Magnon. I'm not suggesting that there should be harassment in the workplace. On the other hand, and then we go on to make our point.
Well, it's a very sensitive issue, and it's good that we're talking about it to the point that you made, Deborah.
And I think what's really important and what I try to do when I do these trainings is harassment is a legal thing, right? This is a glass of water. It's not a bottle of wine, sadly. So we can't call one thing, what it is not. People toss the word harassment around, and it is a legal defined term. If somebody is committing unlawful harassment at the workplace, get them out of there.
Mm-hmm.
Fine them, punishment, fire them. But to say, my boss has been bugging me about where's this brief, bugging me about, I told you I'm not ready. Are you going to work this weekend? No, you can't have your, I can't have you take your vacation right now because you're not done. Person goes to HR saying, I'm being harassed by my boss. True story. That's not lawful harassment.
Well, that's where training
pressure.
comes in,
right?
That the employees need
Right.
to understand what harassment is and what it isn't. I think that that's really important. And, you know, it's something that from a compliance standpoint, and that's something that we really work with our clients quite a bit on. It's important just like any other compliance issue. You know, what is bribery? That's defined as well. When you have global entities who are doing business abroad, they have to understand, those employees have to understand what that is and what it isn't. And I think harassment, sexual harassment, needs to be elevated in the same way. I think that's where companies get into trouble, when they don't take it as seriously.
And I think because there is a regular person, non-lawyer person's word harass that's used, the fact that the law uses the same word makes people mush it. They blend it together because their understand of many people hear harassment is, you're really bugging me, and like, welcome to the world. We get aggravated a lot. But because someone's bugging you doesn't mean what they're doing is unlawful. So I think people need to understand what it is, report it when they see it, report it when they witness it, and the companies get rid of it, root it out.
Sure.
Unlawful harassment. But what we can't do is have everything that's annoying blur and become an unlawful issue. That really, I believe, hurts the very movement that we want to succeed, which is an intolerance for discrimination. And it makes people cynical. It makes people think, oh, my God, the woman didn't get the promotion, so of course she's going to file a harassment claim against me. It makes women classified by people look at it that way as if we're all babies, we're all victims. We can't stand up for ourselves. And that is nothing any of us would want as we go forward trying to have a more diverse, equally respectful workplace.
Deborah, a couple of thoughts here. One of the reasons why I think, as you're a great labor and employment lawyer, is because of the clarity with which you speak. And you and I have had any number of conversations over the years. And yet your point about the use of the term harassment as this elongated term meaning so many things, I think, tragically, I think we're already there. You had any number of people out of Hollywood where so much of the awareness of this came from vis-a-vis Harvey Weinstein and all the tragedies that unfolded from that. But where rape and harassment were convoluted as just different aspects of the same thing, of which they're not. People in the workplace are using the term harassment now for, as you say, for any number of behaviors. But that word in particular is a term of art. It has a legal meaning. So if we're already there, how do we pull that back so that we are able to defend and adjudicate on behalf of the aggrieved, but not create so much collateral damage along the way?
I think that's the question of the moment right now, how you can really say, yay, finally people are feeling confident and safe enough to come forward and say enough. What the women went through with Harvey Weinstein, and you can fill in the blank, horrific, gross, do this or else in this day and age is, these are allegations, is horrific, right? Nobody, I think, can stand up for that and say, well, it's just part of the industry. On the other hand, we don't want the bleed, as you say, which I think has really come over to ruin the very movement that has been so successful. So what do you do about it? So in my world, it's easier for me because I address it every day. Like when I do these trainings, I always say, offensive and obnoxious is not unlawful. And those are the words I use. Everything that's offensive, obnoxious is not unlawful. And you today in this training are going to learn, I have a picture of Julia Child. When you're making a cake, you put certain things in to make a cake. If you put a hammer into a cake, it's not going to make a cake, or it's going to be a bad cake. And you need to understand what the legal ingredients are for harassment. When you see it or witness it, raise your hand. Otherwise, don't come forward if it's not this, because this is something you should try to work out in your life. Or if you're dealing with an obnoxious colleague, HR might certainly help you, but it's not a court issue. And I have in my litigation profile now, sad to say, cases where I would like to think that the women misunderstood what harassment is, but in fact, you don't file a case. These aren't pro se cases filed by the individuals themselves. I think there are people in the legal community who are exploiting the attention to the Me Too movement and exploiting what we discussed before, the reputational damage to companies, and they're bringing what I call shakedown cases. Something, I didn't get the promotion I wanted and I'm a woman, therefore I didn't get the promotion I wanted because I'm a woman. Well, hello, the Grand Canyon lies between those two statements. So just because you don't get something that you wanted doesn't mean it's because of your demographics. And they throw in harassment in these charges. And I just want to say, please, you are hurting this cause that's so important by filing a case like this,
Right.
which has no legal merit. And frankly, you are riding the tailwinds of and denigrating the very group that you should want to be supporting. And they peeve me, which, as you know, is probably the most lovely word I've ever said to describe what I'm really thinking.
But I think we also have to be careful, Deborah, not to. I mean, there's a balance, right? Certainly. I mean, I think it's important and it's great that women are coming forward. It should be a legitimate claim. I agree with you there. But there is a balance that we have to strike. And the underpinning of that is due process, whether it's in the court or it's, in the boardroom. I think it's important to have both sides be heard. And I just, and again, to the point that you made, Richard, we don't want to kind of validate where we are politically here or have to feel like we have to, the alternatives. But I have to say that, I don't want there to be a chilling effect either. Like some of the language that what we're talking about now might suggest that, maybe some women aren't to be believed if they're throwing in, harassment. It erodes the movement. I get that. But I just think that we have to, I think at the base of this, and you mentioned it earlier, the communication is important and people feeling comfortable about communicating, what their comfort zones are.
And I'm not talking about making up facts, to be clear, like don't believe somebody. I'm saying the thing that happened doesn't necessarily mean it's unlawful because it doesn't satisfy all those ingredients that would make harassment. So someone, the attorneys, should be able to say, I understand this bad thing happened to you. I hear you.
That's managing their client is your point.
Correct.
Because I think I don't want there to be a chilling effect for the client to come forward.
Oh, no.
But certainly lawyers should not take advantage of it, and they should manage their clients' expectations.
Really
before law school, I got a graduate degree, and my master's thesis was on pay equity. And I was the first man ever to work in the Women's Rights Division. It was then the largest union in the AFL-CIO, AFSCME. Marched as a young man for the first women's dial-a-ride, the anti-rape, the rape prevention safety that was subsidized by a city. And the list goes on. And yet in this environment, I'm afraid. I feel defensive. As the owner of a company, I'm afraid. And the conversations I have with so many men who I think the term we would use is enlightened and feminist men, who are
woke.
We're woke. We're afraid. So I am. I don't know what we do now. I'm almost speechless because there's this extraordinary fear when I listen to the two of you, so wise and so thoughtful, but also saying we don't want to get to a point where a tipping point, and I fear that we're already there. I look at the statue in Times Square, the unconditional surrender, the VJ Day, victory in Japan, where the sailor is sweeping the woman off her feet when hundreds of thousands of Americans celebrate. And there was Me Too, hashtag Me Too sprayed on it, as if this was a violation, when in fact it was a victory in World War II that threatened our very democracy. So I fear that we're already there. What do you say? What do you say about that in terms of we may already have passed that point?
So I think my first reaction when I hear that, not this is not specific to you, but is that it annoys me. I don't think sexual harassment's hard to understand. I don't. I think you can understand what it is and what it isn't, and don't do it. And if you do it, you should be sanctioned. To say it's so complicated that I'd rather just not deal with women at all is not okay. This is not like being asked to build a rocket where I'd be like, damn, I can't even put together an IKEA bureau, so I'm out. So it is something that if people pause, and I will shock you, can be very direct with people, go, it's just too complicated, I can't. I'm like, stop. What do you do for a living? Well, I do antitrust. Well, what? It is not that complicated. So figure it out, get the lines, and go about your life. Work with women. And if you have somebody who comes forward and says, he asked me twice for this, where my writing was when I was under a lot of stress, that is not an unlawful act. That may be an unpleasant day in the workplace, but you, man, who has asked this person for this assignment twice, also shouldn't fear that you are chilled from treating a woman the way you would treat a man if all you are doing is asking for the work product to be achieved. But the answer isn't, I got to avoid them because I'm too scared.
That's not the argument.
Yeah, that's
right. The argument, Deborah, is the Joe Biden argument that you yourself made just a few minutes ago, which is it's you're engaging in behavior which is not harassment, but that doesn't stop you from being accused and therefore getting all the headline risk you don't want.
I think it comes down to education and communication. I keep coming back to that, and it is unfortunate that you feel this fear that you're referencing. I think that, again, the pendulum has the danger of swinging too far the other way, and maybe it's there. But I think to bring it back, some of it is education, and it's really educating younger folks as well, younger folks than we are in this age. What is appropriate behavior, what isn't? Because I think sometimes, and particularly in the context of a generation of young people who communicate by text. They don't see each other. They don't interact enough. I've had the opportunity to assist a major public university with sexual misconduct investigations. And one of the things that I've noticed is that many of the students just don't understand. They don't have enough interaction, I think, personally, because they're always looking down at their phones and texting and Instagramming. There's a disconnect in terms of interpersonal relations, and I think we need to watch that. I mean, I think that's a canary in the coal mine. How do we take a couple generations now, of young people who don't interact as much face-to-face and get them ready for the workplace where they will? And get them ready to understand where the lines are.
Because you don't have as much experience with social cues.
Right,
when
absolutely.
You're not looking at each other. This is going to sound bizarre, but I had all three of my kids, since Richard raised that issue in the beginning, following my very esteemed footsteps. And I made all of them be servers in restaurants because, as I was for all through high school and college and graduate school, because I think there's an occupation where you learn to deal with people of all stripes. And you have to figure out for yourself, how do I deal with someone? Some are kind, sure. Some are cruel, some are cheap, some are generous, some are rude, some are polite. And you got to let it roll off of you until they violate what everyone should have, which is a personal line that says, no, not here.
Absolutely.
So that helps you really delineate the huge variety of personalities that roam the planet, and you don't have to be friends with everybody. To no, nobody gets to cross this line with me. But
Absolutely.
That line can't be the first time your colleague doesn't smile as broadly as you as he or she did the day before, and that requires, to your point, people working with people
Absolutely.
And figuring it out.
Absolutely. And, more and more people are working from their homes. They just aren't interacting in the same way. And I think that's an issue that we have to address as our society continues to evolve in that way.
And maybe only getting worse because the concept of a liberal arts education is feeling antiquated. Universities are dropping history at a rate of approximately 25% over the last decade, which means we're becoming increasingly ahistorical. It seems like we're only moving in the wrong direction. And newsflash, since Al Gore invented the internet, we're becoming more technologically engaged rather than less. And for those of us old enough to remember, I feel like most of our interactions are with Hal rather than each other.
So on the interacting with one another, I went to a program for Women's History Month, and there was a terrific speaker there who does interventions all around the world to teach women and people how to eliminate violence against women in the workplace. So she works with women who are candidates in countries where to be a female candidate is to subject yourself to possible murder. What she said about what she's learned in her studies about the workplaces, the number one way to get rid of discrimination at work is not law, it's not HR, it's not any compliance, it's the one-on-one. The first time you say to me, you give me a joke, your top anti-Semitic joke, because both of us are Christian for our illustration, I need to make clear to you, because, by the way, I think harassment, it's good we're talking about sexual harassment, but it's all kinds of harassment. When I do these trainings, it's like roll it all in, because racial harassment, disability harassment, religious harassment, all of those things are against the law, just like gender harassment is. So at the first instance, I say to you, it's not funny, or stop.
Right.
And it turns out bigots want friends. And you may, at that one moment, stop it.
Right.
So really, if you want to know how this can get rolled out in a more effective way, if it means things, and I think it's empowering to people at the lower levels of a company to know that they can have a real role in making sure their company doesn't become a place where harassment is tolerated.
That's a really good point.
Whereas if somebody leaves the room, it's like, there's no women in the room, let me tell you my top 3 jokes, and everyone's like, you're hilarious, Joe. Then Joe's like, man, I got friends.
He's emboldened.
I'm going to get some, wait till you hear my next 12 jokes, and now you're off to a really bad place. So you knock it down right away.
So that gets us back to 2 things, Deborah. One, it's, again, the Joe Biden issue, which is if it seems to me that if the Me Too movement is about anything, it's certainly about empowerment. And that is one of the things of empowerment and equality is if you're offended by a comment, to bring it up at the time, not to wait 2 years or 5 years for the opportunistic political moment when you can do the most damage. That's not equality. That's unfairness. And, to me, watching what happened with Joe Biden is, as you talked about earlier, it's not harassment. It may be uncomfortable, but the time to talk about that was one-on-one, was at the time. And to use it for political expediency, it seems to intertwine all of these issues with political gain rather than focusing on what may be the invasion of personal space and an important subject for 2 adults to have.
Now, I get that, to your point, Richard, earlier about there's a real continuum between someone who is guilty of a rape and someone who is guilty of, I kiss the top of your head. That is, we paint with way too broad a brush when we put all those people on the same plane. But a woman who has been subjected to sexual violence, I mentally, I think that you get a whole different pass from waiting to come forward and talking, because it is so traumatic in terms of what the ripple effects will be on your life and coming forward, that to not act exactly in that moment is something that I don't think any of us are in a position to judge. Very different from the shoulder.
I mean, there is a continuum.
Yep.
Well, Deborah, you raise a great point because, and forgive me for this selfish statistic, but almost as many men are violently harassed in long-term relationships as women are, but they're afraid to come forward. So if men are afraid to come forward, certainly men should be sensitive to the fact of how challenging it is for women to come forward. And these are very, very complicated issues. Nicole, we had this conversation a few months ago, and we started touching on the issue of race. And I was just hoping that you could talk a little bit about that in terms of the Me Too movement. The Me Too movement really starts a dozen years ago, and it starts largely as a movement to help quote, brown and black girls, primarily who have no power in this situation. And as the movement became more popular, I feel it became very much more about, the conversations were much more about white women. And I just, not until R. Kelly did we talk about the disempowerment again. And I think the reason why I raised that, and it's very uncomfortable me as a white man to raise this issue. So I'm on, I feel, very uncomfortable turf, if you will. But that it almost feels like, as I hear, and forgive me for this, but white women talking about this issue, it's almost as if, and of our sisters of color gets added in at the last minute, sort of like we need to include them also. And when I look at that, I look at movements historically, and Deborah, this gets back to something you said at the beginning, is that we are all victims, but almost all of us are perpetrators as well. And when we look at ourselves as victims. We also have to look in the mirror and ask, but what am I doing that's an act of privilege, or what benefits do I have? And I think that as we become more Buddhist, if we look more honestly at ourselves, we can become a little less automatically judgmental, a little bit more sensitive both ways, both as accuser and accused. We can listen more, which to the points that both of you were making earlier seems so critical to being able to satisfactorily address this issue over time.
Well, I think that certainly race may play a role in terms of a woman being taken seriously or, valued in this context. But I really think at base with any type of discrimination, it's really about looking at what are the root causes, how can we communicate and educate in a way that hopefully, reduces these issues. And just be comfortable in society to speak to it, though, to the point that you've made, and I think this is something that we talked about before. I often relate more by my race than my sex. I find that the women's movement is more of a white woman's movement, to be quite frank. I have a good friend who was looking at these issues and looking to highlight some of these issues historically, and I said to her, make sure that you tell the whole story. This isn't an easy topic. It can't just be white women. It can't just be Asian women. It's got to be all women. And we all have a different perspective and lens through which we are viewing these issues. And so, it's something, again, it's about communication. And it's really, I think, making people aware that maybe they are excluding certain groups or, in terms of their individual experiences. I mean, at base, in the Me Too context, maybe some of the offending activities may be the same, but how they are viewed when a woman comes forward, if she's a white woman versus a woman of color, may be different, and being sensitive to that.
Well, one of the I think principal things to go back to when talking about sexual harassment is people's notion of it may be because the word is sexual harassment. It's about sex. It's about abuse of power. And to the extent that people in certain there's a correlation between certain economic levels and certain national origin and race, there is a sense that you can get away with it more. That because they won't have the means to speak up because they might lose their job, which makes it even more invidious. But it really is about abuse of power. And if you ever look at court TV tapes of sexual harassment cases, it utterly kills the people's notion that sexual harassment is about some smoking hot guy who's interested in some smoking hot woman. Oh, no. They come in all ages, sizes, races, body types. And it really is just, I can do this to you because this is who I am, so I will, and what are you going to do about it? And what's great about the movement today is women are saying, individually, I may have felt powerless, but collectively, we're coming at you. And I'm all in on that. It's just that what we're coming in on should be the people who are actually doing the unlawful harassment, not the people who are doing these things on the margins. Where two people can say to each other, like, that's my parking space, that's my...
it sounds like a lot of your cases are kind of, in some ways, false claims.
Well, see, I don't like to use the word false claims because I don't think they're women as liars.
Yes.
I think they're women as misunderstanding the difference between, I didn't get the promotion that I wanted, therefore and I'm a woman, therefore I didn't get it because I'm a woman. And then their lawyers, frankly, prey on, not the women, the lawyers prey on, damn, this client's going to settle. Because once I toss the word sexual harassment in here, it's going to be a reputational hit. And I believe companies have to be thoughtful, fair, get rid of the bad guys and the bad women, stick by their employment decisions if they've been properly vetted, and just let people come at you. And you just got to show, I believe in who we are if you've done it the right way. And then one more point about the men. So the other way we talk about sexual harassment is women are always the victims. So men are equally protected under Title VII, and we don't talk about the men much. So men are protected from sexual harassment by women, which doesn't happen as much because it's an abuse of power, and sadly women still are not in power at all as much as men are, whether in law firms or corporate life, they just aren't. And men are also protected from sexual harassment by other men, as women are protected from sexual harassment by other women, all under Title VII, even though unbelievably we still don't have sexual orientation protected under Title VII. We do have, sex discrimination doesn't include homosexuality. Nonetheless, it does protect that within Title VII. So it turns out, Richard, that men disproportionately don't come forward with allegations when they're sexually harassed. Mm-hmm. And you know who's the hardest on men that make them not come forward? Other men. Because the men feel like, wait a minute, this woman's hitting on you? The old movie with Michael Douglas and Demi Moore, Disclosure, where she's beautiful and she wants him, and his friends in this movie are like, wait a minute, let me get this right. Your boss is smoking hot. She'll give you all this extra money, promotion time if you just sleep with her. I don't see there's a problem here. This is like the greatest day in life, which is a cartoon of what it really feels like to be subjected to sexual harassment. And the other way men are hard on men is if it's male-on-male harassment, which is hard to believe in 2019. But there's this, you're gay or you're attracting gay people. So men who are victims of sexual harassment really still feel silenced. And they're not in the Me Too movement as squarely as women are because it's construed as a women's movement. So all of it's got to stop. Same gender, cross gender,
right.
All of it's got to stop.
Behave
it's
well.
Equally unlawful.
And sometimes I think people feel that the more we shout about unfairness, then as a result, that they can avoid that reflection. As someone who travels around the world all the time, and I hear Americans talk about diversity, and it's pretty embarrassing, quite frankly. I mean, you walk around the streets of London, diversity looks a lot different. You walk around the streets of Abu Dhabi or Sana'a or other cities around the world, and the world looks a lot different than our perception of a diversity. And I think diversity is only going to get more complicated as more of us are doing the 23andMe or whatever, these DNA tests, right, to describe and find out that we're all 1,000 times more diverse than Elizabeth Warren ever said that she claimed to be. And then what categories do we fall in? That we're all more alike than we are different, but that requires sensitivity and not weaponizing our complaints. And whether it's opportunistic lawyers or it's HR who have weaponized some of these claims, we're at a point in time where I think because of whether it's hatred or insecurity, we're becoming more litigious and we're worrying about profit less, we're worrying about the purpose of business less, and we're engaged more frequently in fighting amongst ourselves, which is an extraordinary challenge.
And and that tone is set from the top in many areas in society. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think we are very divided as a nation, very unfortunate, and leadership could help that. Kind of different messaging from the top. And it's from the top of the corporate world, political world. I mean, it's unfortunate, and as I look at it. At a time where we have a lot of asymmetrical challenges, and dangers in this world, for the United States not to, be at a point where we recognize that there's more that we have in common than is different is very sad.
So
really
you both raised issues of diversity and also listening. And there's two things that can sometimes clash because any decent company wants diversity, embraces diversity, understands how much better the company is. And there are studies that show empirically companies with diversity make more money. So if you aren't doing it because you're just a good
right
soul,
reasons, right?
do it because you're going to get rich.
Right.
So great. But with diversity comes opportunities to listen. And if you don't listen, you can get in more clashes. For example, if you really have a diverse workforce from various countries, kissing twice on the cheek is a nothing in some countries. Shaking hands in our country is what you do. Shaking hands in other cultures be absolutely inappropriate. Making eye contact, we get insulted if people don't make eye contact. In some cultures, that's insulting. I don't know all these things. I've learned a lot as an employment lawyer. But here's where we go to the granular level. So if I don't know when I greet you that to shake your hand is offensive to you, it would be great if you would tell me, and I will stop.
Right.
So this is where at the base level, everybody could help the other if we actually listen and want to learn from
right.
this person who has really graced our workplace with experiences and a perspective that we didn't know about.
Right. Cultural competence is important, and that should be part of the training in global workforces, global companies. That's really important, and there's a reason why we have one mouth and two ears. We should listen more and speak less.
So as the host, I think that means it's time for me to draw this podcast to a close. Let me ask
It's also a great line in Hamilton. Talk less.
One closing question. In Cleveland, they banned the song "Baby It's Cold Outside," which came out in 1949. And other radio stations, for at least a brief period of time, talked about following suit.
But baby, it's cold outside. But baby, it's cold outside.
Where are we at a point in time where we have to be worried about post-World War II songs being banned because they are interpreted by some as representing things that they don't?
I mean, it's a hard issue. It really is. I mean, I don't agree with that decision that was made. And I think it goes to your point about history and understanding different times. Like you mentioned the Joe Biden situation, he came from a different generation. You know, there's something for him to learn, and maybe there's something for folks who may have, misinterpreted his intentions to maybe give him the benefit of the doubt. I mean, I think it's unfortunate that it's like a scorched earth kind of approach, like what you mentioned with, men saying, okay, women and men can't travel anymore. I mean, because an issue is perceived as too difficult, it's just a scorched earth response. Just get rid of it all. It's like when books were burned and banned. I mean, it's a problem. And I just think that it's born out of people not knowing their history, not listening, not communicating in a way that furthers understanding as opposed to misunderstanding. And I just hope that we see a point where this isn't as much of an issue as it is today.
New York has recently passed some laws that out California. I say that because California has been the most pro-employee jurisdiction in the country, almost its own country. And the essence of one of New York's laws, honest to God, is you hurt my feelings. And that could be a cause of action. When I saw that, I thought, dear God, we're grown-ups. Don't treat us like we're babies. And this, I think, it would be interesting to hear what the legislative session sounded like on that, because if that becomes the standard, that you hurt my feelings today, not literally for some slight, not because of something that is, again, I hope I've made this clear by saying this 4,000 times, because I don't want to get hate mail through Richard that says, Deborah Kelly hates women and thinks they're all lying Schechter artists, because that's not what I've said, okay? You identify what the conduct is, you crush the people who engage in it, you raise your hand, the investigations go forward, things are taken care of. But if we are going to go so overreacting that, some very smart companies, I should say very otherwise smart companies, think sex segregation is a really good idea to avoid harassment, really bad idea. And legislatures are trivializing the workplace as if we're all infants. That's definitely going to have a negative effect, I think, on the idea that men and women truly are equal. We can take care of ourselves. We expect dignity. We demand dignity, but we don't demand to be coddled, for God's sakes. That's not what we're asking for.
Well, it's interesting in our culture, if you look at the issues around freedom of speech on college campuses, there's this notion that you can't have speech that you disagree with. You go, God, if my child hears that, it's a problem. And I think it's a balance. And I think that, to the point that I made earlier about, young adults learning how to interact interpersonally. Some of it has to do with being exposed to things you may not agree with, and how do you deal with that? How do you process it? How do you have an intelligent conversation or a debate about it, and not go into a shell because it offended you somehow?
Nicole, you get the last word for Nicole Lamb-Hale of Kroll and Deborah Kelly of Manette. Thank you so much for joining me on this inaugural podcast of Real Washington. I'm Richard Levick. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Join the conversation and follow @Levick on Twitter. Don't forget to subscribe to Real Washington on your favorite podcast app and leave a 5-star review. Levick, fixing the impossible.